The train whistle echoed across the Colorado plains as Clara Whitmore stepped onto the platform, her worn dress clinging to her frail frame. She'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, carrying nothing but hope and a persistent cough that had followed her from Pennsylvania. The man waiting for her took one look at her pale complexion and hollow cheeks, then spat into the dust. "I ordered a wife, not a coffin." With those cruel words, he turned his back and left her standing there with nothing but a battered suitcase and fading daylight. From across the dusty street, rancher Eli Ramsey watched the scene unfold, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. What would drive a man to show such mercy to a dying woman when everyone else had given up on her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Ramsey had been watching the train platform from his usual spot outside McCrady's general store for the better part of an hour, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 42, he'd developed the patience of a man who'd learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes, whether you were breaking horses or waiting for supplies to arrive from Denver. His weathered hands wrapped around the tin cup as he observed the small drama unfolding across the dusty street. The woman who'd stepped off the afternoon train carried herself with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't diminish. Even from this distance, Eli could see the careful way she held her shoulders straight despite the obvious frailty of her frame. Her dark hair, though simply pinned, caught the late afternoon light, and there was something in her posture that spoke of breeding, the kind that came from good family, not money. Harold Briggs, the man who'd summoned her from back east, was exactly the sort of fellow Eli had expected would order a bride through the mail. Thick around the middle, with hands that looked more familiar with counting coins than honest. Work, Briggs ran the largest mercantile operation in 3 counties. He'd been bragging for weeks about his investment in matrimony, as he called it, describing his intended bride like she was livestock he'd purchased sight unseen. The rejection was swift and brutal. Eli watched Briggs circle the woman once, taking in her appearance with the calculating eyes of a man inspecting damaged goods. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the quiet street. "I ordered a wife, not a coffin. You look half dead already." Without another word, Briggs climbed into his wagon and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a woman standing alone on the platform. Something twisted in Eli's chest as he watched her carefully lower herself onto her worn suitcase, her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't cry, didn't call out after Briggs, didn't collapse in despair. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and gazed out at the mountains rising beyond the town, as if she were taking inventory of her options with the same methodical approach she might use to assess a difficult recipe. The familiar weight of his father's pocket watch pressed against his vest pocket. Eli pulled it out and flipped it open, noting the motionless hands frozen at 3:47, the exact time his father had drawn his last breath 8 years ago. Since that day, Eli had carried the broken timepiece like a talisman of his own stopped life, a reminder that some things, once broken, never quite worked the same way again. His ranch sat 15 miles northeast of town, carved out of valley. Land that most folks considered too remote for civilized living. Eli preferred it that way. After losing his parents to influenza and his intended bride to a traveling salesman's promises, he discovered that solitude suited him better than society. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as sunrise. Tend the horses at dawn. Check the fence lines, repair whatever the previous day's work had damaged, prepare a simple meal, and fall asleep to the sound of wind through the pine trees. Dr. Samuel Morrison emerged from his small office 2 buildings down from where Eli stood, medical bag in hand, and concern etched across his kind face. The doctor was one of the few people in town who'd earned Eli's genuine respect over the years, a man who'd served as both physician and unofficial minister to folks who couldn't afford either calling separately. "Afternoon, Eli," Dr. Morrison said, approaching with the measured pace of someone who'd seen enough human suffering to know when to hurry and when to proceed with care. I was just thinking about heading over to check on that young lady. Doesn't look like she's in the best condition for sitting on a train platform in this weather. Eli glanced at the western sky, noting the way the clouds were building over the mountains. "Storm coming in," he observed. "She'll need shelter soon." "Indeed, she will." Dr. Morrison studied Eli's face with the perceptive gaze that had served him well in diagnosing ailments that went deeper than the physical. Course, Martha Henderson mentioned she might have room at the boarding house, though you know how Martha feels about taking in folks who can't pay their way immediately. They both knew Martha Henderson's boarding house was already full, and even if it weren't, Martha's Christian charity had strict limits when it came to anyone who appeared to be dying on her premises. Bad for business, she'd say, and in a town where reputation meant survival, most folks understood her position, even if they didn't admire it. "What do you make of her condition?" Eli asked, surprising himself with the question. Dr. Morrison adjusted his spectacles and observed the woman more carefully. "Hard to say from here, but she's got the look of someone who's been fighting something for a while. Could be consumption, could be something else entirely. Won't know until I examine her properly." He paused, then added with the gentle directness that made him effective as both doctor and counselor. "Course, she'd need somewhere to rest while she recovers, assuming she's willing to fight for her health." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Eli had the space, the means, and if he was honest with himself, a growing compulsion to help that he couldn't quite explain. His ranch house had been built for a family that never came to be, with extra bedrooms that had stood empty for years, and a kitchen that rarely saw use beyond his basic needs. "She's got breeding," Eli said finally, more to himself than to Dr. Morrison. "That she does. Came from Pennsylvania, according to the correspondence Harold showed around town. Family name of Whitmore, I believe." Dr. Morrison's tone carried the weight of information shared in confidence. "Whatever brought her out here, it wasn't desperation alone. Takes considerable courage to travel that distance to marry a stranger." As if summoned by their conversation, Clara Whitmore rose from her makeshift seat with careful dignity, lifted her suitcase, and began walking slowly toward the main street. Her steps were measured, purposeful, though Eli could see the effort each one required. She wasn't giving up, he realized. She was simply beginning the next chapter of whatever plan had brought her this far. "I'd better go check on her," Dr. Morrison said, starting across the street. Eli found himself falling into step beside the doctor, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. As they approached, Clara looked up with eyes the color of winter sky, pale, blue touched with gray, holding depths that spoke of experiences beyond her apparent years. "Ma'am," Dr. Morrison said gently, removing his hat, "I'm Dr. Morrison, and this is Eli Ramsey. We couldn't help but notice you might need some assistance." Clara's smile was polite but wary. "That's very kind of you both. I'm Clara Whitmore." Her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education, but underneath lay a weariness that spoke of long struggles. "I'm afraid I find myself in somewhat reduced circumstances. These things happen," Dr. Morrison said diplomatically. "If you don't mind me asking, how are you feeling? You look like you might benefit from some rest and proper care." For a moment, Clara's carefully maintained composure flickered, revealing the exhaustion and uncertainty beneath. "I've been better," she admitted quietly. "The journey was longer than I expected, and I haven't been entirely well for some time." Eli surprised himself by speaking. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. It's quiet, and there's room if you need somewhere to recover your strength." The words came out more abruptly than he'd intended, causing both Clara and Dr. Morrison to look at him with varying degrees of surprise. Clara studied his face with those penetrating eyes, as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because after a long moment, she nodded. "That's very generous. Mr. Ramsey, I wouldn't want to impose, but I confess I don't have many alternatives at the moment. No imposition, Eli said gruffly, already wondering what had possessed him to make the offer. Doc can ride out in a day or two to check on you properly. Dr. Morrison looked between them with the satisfaction of a man who just witnessed the beginning of something significant. I'll gather some supplies and medicines that might help, he said. Eli, why don't you get your wagon? I don't think Miss Whitmore should be riding horseback in her current condition. As Eli walked toward the livery stable to retrieve his wagon, he felt the broken pocket watch ticking against his chest for the first time in 8 years. He stopped, pulled it out, and stared at the face in amazement. The hands were moving again, marking time as steadily as if they'd never stopped. 3:52, 3:53, 3:54. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Morrison speaking quietly with Clara, his voice carrying the professional gentleness that put patients at ease. Eli pocketed the watch and continued toward the stable, his mind already turning to the practical matters of making his house suitable for a guest. It had been so long since anyone had stayed there that he wasn't entirely sure where to begin. But as he hitched his horses to the wagon and prepared to drive back to collect Clara Whitmore, Eli found himself looking forward to the challenge in a way that surprised him. Perhaps it was time for life to start moving forward again, like the hands of his father's watch, marking moments that led somewhere new instead of standing still in memory of what was lost. The wagon ride to Eli's ranch began in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of leather harness. Clara sat beside him on the bench seat, her back straight, despite the obvious exhaustion that seemed to permeate her entire being. She'd accepted his offered blanket without protest, wrapping it around her shoulders with the grateful care of someone who understood the value of warmth. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with stands of aspen and pine. The late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and Clara found herself breathing more deeply than she had in months. The air here carried the scent of pine needles and approaching rain, so different from the coal smoke and crowded humanity she'd left behind in Pennsylvania. It's beautiful, she said softly, breaking the silence as they crested a hill that revealed the valley spread below them. I hadn't expected the mountains to be so alive. Eli glanced at her, noting the way her eyes had brightened for the first time since he'd observed her on the platform. Takes some getting used to, he replied. The quiet can be overwhelming for folks accustomed to city life. I think I might prefer the quiet, Clara admitted, then seemed to catch herself, as if she'd revealed more than intended. The train was quite crowded, and before that, she trailed off, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch something. Beneath her coat, they descended into the valley as the first drops of rain began to fall, large and scattered at first, then with increasing intensity. Eli urged the horses into a quicker pace, not wanting Clara to get soaked in her weakened condition. As they rounded the final bend in the road, his ranch house came into view, a solid, 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. Home, Eli said simply, though the word felt strange on his tongue. He'd been living there for 8 years, but it had never quite felt like home without someone to share it with. Clara studied the house as they approached, taking in the well-maintained barn, the neat fence lines, and the garden plot that had been prepared for spring planting. You built this yourself? She asked. My father and I started it when I was 25, Eli replied, pulling the wagon up to the front porch. Finished it after he passed, thinking I'd... He stopped himself, unwilling to share the story of his broken engagement with this woman. He barely knew, thinking you'd fill it with a family, Clara finished gently, understanding crossing her features. I can see it was designed for more than one person. Eli helped her down from the wagon, noting how heavily she leaned on his arm, and the way her breathing seemed labored after the relatively short journey. Let's get you inside before this rain gets worse, he said, reaching for her suitcase. The interior of the house was clean, but clearly the domain of a man who lived alone. The furniture was well made but sparse, and there was a peculiar emptiness that came from rooms meant to be filled with conversation and laughter that echoed only with solitary footsteps. Clara took it all in without comment, but Eli found himself seeing his home through her eyes and finding it lacking. "The guest room is upstairs," he said, leading the way. "It's not much, but the bed is comfortable and there's a good view of the mountains." Clara followed him up the wooden stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth banister that showed the careful craftsmanship of someone who took pride in his work. The guest room was indeed simple: a bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, a chair by the window, and little else. But it was clean and warm, and after weeks of uncertainty, it represented something Clara had almost forgotten: sanctuary. "This is perfect," she said, setting her suitcase on the chair. "I can't tell you how grateful I am, Mr. Ramsey. I know this must seem like an enormous imposition." "Call me Eli," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "And it's not an imposition. House has been too quiet for too long anyway." As if to emphasize his point, thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began to fall in earnest against the windows. Clara moved to look out at the storm, pressing her hand against the cool glass. In the reflection, Eli could see the exhaustion in her face more clearly, along with something else, a deep sadness that seemed to go beyond her current circumstances. "I should let you rest," he said, starting toward the door. "I'll put together some supper in a while, nothing fancy." "Eli," Clara called softly, stopping him at the threshold. When he turned back, she was still facing the window, but her posture had changed, becoming somehow smaller and more vulnerable. "I need you to know that I'm not entirely what I seem." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Eli waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him was important. "The illness that Mr. Briggs found so objectionable," she continued, still not turning around. "It's not consumption, as most people assume. It's something else entirely, something that—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Something that was done to me, rather than something I caught." Eli felt a cold anger begin to build in his chest. "Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question, and Clara's slight nod confirmed his suspicions. "For months, little by little. I didn't understand what was happening at first. I thought I was simply unwell, perhaps overworked or suffering from the strain of difficult circumstances. It wasn't until I became suspicious and began refusing certain foods, certain drinks, that I began to recover enough to realize the truth." "Who?" The single word came out harder than Eli intended. Clara finally turned from the window, and he could see tears threatening in her eyes. "Someone who claimed to love me. Someone who wanted to ensure I remained dependent, controllable, grateful for his care." She reached into her coat with trembling fingers and withdrew a small object, a delicate gold wedding ring that caught the lamplight. "This was my mother's. It's the only thing of value I have left, and the only proof of who I used to be before. I became someone who could be managed." Eli crossed the room in 2 quick strides, his hands gentle as he took her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "Whatever happened before, whoever did this to you, they can't reach you here." Clara looked up at him with those winter sky eyes, searching his face. "You don't know that. You don't know who he is, what he's capable of. I may have brought danger to your doorstep simply by being here. Then we'll face it together," Eli said, the words surprising him with their certainty. "You're not alone anymore, Clara." Something shifted in her expression at his words, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself, allowing a glimpse of the woman she might have been before fear and betrayal changed her. "I don't understand why you're helping me. You don't know anything about me, about my past, about what I might have done to deserve—" "Stop." Eli's voice was firm but gentle. "Whatever happened to you, you didn't deserve it. No one deserves to be poisoned by someone they trusted, Thunder crashed overhead, and Clara startled slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through Eli's chest, and he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the past hour. This woman, fragile and frightened as she was, had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried with his old dreams. "Rest now," he said softly. "We can talk more tomorrow when you've had time to recover from the journey. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out." Clara nodded, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confession. "Thank you, Eli, for listening, for not turning away when I told you the truth." "The truth is what makes trust possible," he replied, a piece of wisdom his father had shared years ago. "Get some sleep. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." As Eli closed the door behind him and made his way back to the kitchen, he found himself thinking about the wedding ring Clara had shown him, not just as a symbol of her past, but as evidence of the life she'd been forced to leave behind. Someone had tried to destroy her slowly, systematically, and the fact that she'd found the strength to escape spoke to a core of steel beneath her fragile appearance. He pulled out his father's pocket watch again, noting that the hands continued their steady movement. 6:15, 6:16, 6:17. Time moving forward, carrying them all toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in years, Eli found himself looking forward to seeing what tomorrow might bring, rather than simply enduring it. Outside, the storm intensified. But inside the ranch house, something new was beginning, fragile as a seedling, but rooted in honesty and the recognition that sometimes salvation came in the form of two damaged people choosing to trust each other with their broken pieces. Clara woke to the sound of gentle movement in the kitchen below and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, allowing herself to savor the sensation of feeling truly safe for the first time in months. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline morning that painted the mountains. In shades of silver and blue, she rose carefully, testing her strength and finding it marginally improved after a full night's rest. Her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser showed the same pale complexion and hollow cheeks that had prompted Harold Briggs's cruel rejection, but her eyes held something they hadn't possessed in Pennsylvania, a spark of hope that she'd thought permanently extinguished. Downstairs, she found Eli at the kitchen table, already dressed for the day's work, and studying what appeared to be a ledger of ranch accounts. He looked up as she entered, his weathered face creasing into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's fresh, and there's bread if you're hungry." "Thank you." Clara poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, inhaling the steam gratefully. "I don't remember the last time I slept so well." Eli closed the ledger and studied her face with the careful attention of someone assessing improvement in an injured animal. "Color's better," he observed. "Rest suits you." As Clara moved about the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast of bread and butter, she noticed a well-worn cookbook tucked between a jar of preserves and a tin of flour. The binding was cracked with age, and the pages showed the gentle staining that came from years of regular use. She touched it gently, and Eli noticed her interest. "That was my mother's," he said quietly. "She was quite the cook in her day. Haven't opened it in years." Clara carefully lifted the book, feeling the weight of memory and tradition in her hands. The pages fell open to a recipe for apple preserves, written in a careful feminine hand, with notes added in the margins, reminders about cooking times and ingredient substitutions that spoke of a woman who took pride in feeding her family well. She had beautiful handwriting, Clara said softly. "You can tell she put love into everything she made." She did indeed. Eli's voice carried the warm sadness of old grief, well-weathered but never entirely absent. "Used to say that food was just another way of taking care of the people you loved." Clara found herself thinking of her own mother, who had taught her the same philosophy in their Pennsylvania kitchen before consumption claimed her when Clara was 16. "I'd like to cook for you," she said suddenly, then caught herself. color rising in her cheeks. "I mean to help earn my keep while I'm here. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Eli said firmly. "But if cooking would make you feel more settled, I won't argue. Been eating my own cooking for 8 years, and it's nothing to celebrate." The admission made Clara smile. The first genuine smile Eli had seen from her. It transformed her face completely, hinting at the vibrant woman who existed beneath the layers of exhaustion and fear. Then it settled. "Though I should warn you, I may need to start slowly. My strength isn't entirely reliable." "Yet, we'll take it as it comes," Eli replied, rising from the table. "I need to check on the horses and mend some fence this morning. You rest as much as you need, and don't feel obligated to do anything you're not ready for." After Eli left for his morning chores, Clara spent time exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. She discovered a pantry well stocked with basics: flour, beans, salt pork, canned goods, and root vegetables stored in wooden bins. Everything was organized with the methodical care of a man who lived alone and had learned to plan ahead. But there was an emptiness to it that spoke of meals prepared for survival rather than pleasure. She found herself planning simple dishes that might bring warmth and comfort to the house. A pot of beans with herbs from the garden she'd noticed outside the kitchen window. Bread made with the sourdough starter she spotted fermenting in a corner of the pantry. Perhaps a pie using the preserved fruits lining the shelves. The physical act of planning meals felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had been systematically stripped away in Pennsylvania. There, every meal had become a source of anxiety, every bite a potential threat. Here, in Eli's kitchen with his mother's cookbook open before her, cooking felt like an act of creation rather than survival. Around midday, she began her first real effort, a simple pot of bean soup that would simmer slowly and fill the house with the kind of comforting aromas she remembered from her childhood. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a habit she'd lost months ago, but that seemed to return naturally in this peaceful space. Eli returned for lunch to find the kitchen transformed. The soup pot bubbled gently on the stove. Fresh bread cooled on the counter, and Clara moved about the space with the fluid grace of someone who belonged there. The change in the atmosphere was remarkable. What had been a functional but sterile room now felt warm and alive. "Smells like home," he said quietly, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Clara looked up from slicing the bread, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the stove and the satisfaction of useful work. "I hope you don't mind. I found some herbs in your garden. They needed thinning anyway, and the beans were perfect for soup." Eli settled at the table as Clara served him a bowl of the fragrant soup and a thick slice of still warm bread. The first taste transported him back to childhood, memories of his mother's kitchen, but it was more than nostalgia. This was different, better somehow, seasoned not just with herbs, but with care and attention that had been missing from his solitary meals. "This is remarkable," he said after several spoonfuls. "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." Clara took her own seat across from him, pleased by his obvious enjoyment. "My mother always said that hunger was the best seasoning, but I think contentment works just as well." They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Clara, it was the first meal in months that she'd prepared and eaten without fear. For Eli, it was a reminder of what he'd given up when he'd chosen solitude over the risk of loss. "I should tell you," Clara said eventually, setting down her spoon, "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about facing whatever comes together. I want you to know that I meant what I said about bringing danger. The man I escaped from, he's not the type to simply accept loss." Eli studied her face, noting the way her jaw tightened with determination, even as worry shadowed her eyes. "Tell me about him." Clara was quiet for a long moment, gathering her courage. "His name is Marcus Ashford. In Pennsylvania, he's considered quite the catch. Wealthy, well-connected, charming when it suits his purposes. We were engaged to be married, an arrangement made between our families when I turned 21. Arranged, Eli repeated, understanding dawning in his voice. My father was ill, and the medical bills were mounting. Marcus offered to cover all expenses in exchange for my hand in marriage. At first he seemed kind, attentive. It wasn't until after the engagement was announced that things began to change. Clara's fingers unconsciously moved to her throat, a gesture that made Eli's hands clench involuntarily. He became possessive, controlling. When I began to question some of his demands, when I started to assert my own wishes about our future, that's when the illness began. Slowly at first, just fatigue and weakness that could be attributed to wedding stress, but it progressed, and I became increasingly dependent on his care. How did you figure out what he was doing? My father's doctor, Clara said quietly. Dr. Patterson had known me since childhood, and something about my symptoms troubled him. He began asking careful questions, and eventually he shared his suspicions with me privately. He helped me understand what to watch for, how to protect myself. When my father passed, Dr. Patterson gave me enough money to escape and warned me that I needed to get as far away as possible. Eli absorbed this information, his respect for Clara's courage growing. And you think he'll follow you here? I know he will. Marcus doesn't accept defeat, and he has the resources to hire people to find me. I used a false name to book my passage west, but determined people can trace such things if they're willing to spend enough money. Then we'll be ready for him, Eli said simply. Clara looked across the table at this man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she'd received in months, and felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the soup or the fire in the stove. You barely know me, she said softly. Why would you risk so much for a stranger? Eli considered the question seriously, as he did most things. Maybe because you're not a stranger anymore, he said finally. Maybe because some things are worth the risk. The afternoon passed quietly, with Clara resting while Eli returned to his work. But the kitchen retained the warmth of their shared meal and conversation, and both found themselves looking forward to evening with an anticipation that neither had felt in far too long. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous to Clara. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Eli beginning his day, the soft thud of boots on the wooden floor below, the quiet opening and closing of the kitchen door as he went out to tend the animals. She would lie in bed for a few moments, savoring the luxury of waking without fear, then rise to prepare breakfast for them both. Her strength returned gradually but steadily. The simple act of eating food she'd prepared herself, knowing it was safe, allowed her body to begin healing from months of slow poisoning. Color returned to her cheeks, and the hollow look around her eyes began to fill in. More importantly, the constant tension that had gripped her shoulders started to ease. Eli was a patient teacher when it came to ranch life. In the afternoons, when the day's major work was done, he would show her around the property, how to gather eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, where the best herbs grew wild in the meadow, how to read the weather by watching the way the horses behaved. Clara absorbed it all with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a world she'd never known existed. It was during one of these afternoon explorations that she discovered the small wooden horse, carved with obvious care and considerable skill. She found it tucked away on a shelf in the barn, partially hidden behind a coil of rope, but positioned where it could catch the late afternoon light that slanted through the barn door. "This is beautiful," she said, lifting it carefully. The wood was smooth from handling, and every detail, from the flowing mane to the prancing hooves, had been carved with the kind of attention that spoke of long, lonely evenings and hands that needed something to occupy them. Eli looked embarrassed when he saw what she'd found. "Just something to do with my hands," he said gruffly. "Helps me think." Clara turned the horse over in her palms, feeling the warmth the wood had absorbed from the afternoon sun. There was something achingly beautiful about this hidden piece. of artistry, created not for display or sale, but simply for the joy of making something perfect. "You have real talent," she said quietly. "This is better than anything I've seen in the finest shops in Philadelphia." "It's just whittling," Eli replied, but Clara could see the pleasure her praise brought him. "No," she said firmly, "this is art. This is someone taking a piece of wood and breathing life into it." She looked up at him, noting the way the afternoon light brought out the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "How many others have you made?" Eli was quiet for a moment, then led her to a corner of the barn where a wooden crate sat covered with an old blanket. Beneath the covering, Clara discovered an entire menagerie. Horses in various poses, a family of rabbits, a pair of eagles with wings spread in flight, and most touching of all, a small collection of farm animals that looked like they were designed to be toys for children. "Oh, Eli," she breathed, lifting a perfectly carved sheep. "These are extraordinary. Why do you keep them hidden away?" "Never had anyone to show them to," he admitted. "Seemed pointless to have them cluttering up the house. When it was just me." Clara felt her heart constrict at the loneliness implicit in those words. Here was a man who created beauty in solitude, not because he expected anyone to see it, but because something in his nature compelled him to bring life from lifeless wood. Would you consider making something for the house? Something we could both enjoy?" The word "we" hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither quite dared to examine too closely. But Eli nodded slowly, already envisioning possibilities. "What would you like?" "Something for the kitchen," Clara said immediately. "Maybe a set of salt and pepper holders, or a spoon rest, something practical that would also be beautiful." That evening, as Clara prepared supper, Eli worked at the kitchen table with a piece of cherry wood he'd been saving for a special project. The domesticity of the scene. Clara stirring soup, while Eli's carving knife shaped wood with practiced strokes, felt like something from a dream of the life she'd once imagined having. "Tell me about your family," Eli said as he worked, the request coming out more gently than his usual direct manner of speaking. Clara was quiet for a moment, tasting the soup and adjusting the seasoning. "My father was a schoolmaster," she said. Finally, he loved books, learning, the idea that education could lift people above their circumstances. My mother was the one who taught me that a home should be a refuge, a place where people could be themselves without fear or pretense." "Sounds like good people." "They were." Clara's voice carried the warmth of genuine affection. "They would have. Liked you, I think. My father especially. He always said that the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him in return." Eli looked up from his carving, considering this. "What would they think of your current situation?" Clara set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "My father would be proud that I found the courage to leave. My mother—" She paused, touching the wedding ring that hung on a chain beneath her dress. "My mother would tell me to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts tell me that you're the finest man I've ever known." The simple declaration hit Eli with unexpected force. He set down his carving knife and looked at Clara, really looked at her, taking in the way her dark hair caught the lamplight, the gentle strength in her hands as she worked, the growing confidence in her posture that spoke of a spirit refusing to be broken. "Clara," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her breath catch. "Yes? I want you to know that whatever happens, however long you stay here, you're not alone anymore. You don't have to face whatever comes, next by yourself." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. "I've never had anyone say that to me before," she admitted. "Even when I was engaged to Marcus, I never felt like I had a true partner, someone who would stand with me rather than simply expect me to follow." "That's what partnership should be," Eli said firmly. "Two people choosing to face the world together, each making the other stronger." They held each other's gaze across the kitchen, and Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that was entirely different from the gratitude and relief she'd been feeling. This was something deeper, more Dangerous and infinitely more precious. The soup is ready, she said softly, but neither of them moved immediately. Clara, Eli said again, and this time her name sounded like a question. Yes, I'm glad you're here. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of complete honesty. Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy that had been too long absent. So am I, Eli. So am I. As they shared their evening meal, the carved wooden horse sat on the windowsill where Clara had placed it, catching the last rays of sunlight and casting dancing shadows on the kitchen wall. Outside, the mountains stood sentinel over the valley, and inside, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss began to discover what it meant to hope again. 3 weeks into Clara's stay at the ranch, the first real test of their growing bond came in the form of a supply run to town. Clara had been pressing wildflowers she found during her walks around the property, creating delicate arrangements that she pressed between the pages of Eli's father's old books. The activity brought her peace and seemed to symbolize her own transformation, taking something fragile and making it permanent, beautiful, and lasting. "I'd like to come with you today," Clara announced over breakfast, her voice carrying a determination that Eli had learned to recognize. "I can't hide here forever, and I need to start facing the world again." Eli studied her face, noting the improved color in her cheeks and the steadier way she held herself. The frightened, half-starved woman who had arrived on the train platform had been replaced by someone stronger, though the underlying vulnerability remained. "Are you sure you're ready for that? Town can be curious about newcomers. All the more reason to face it now, while I have you with me," Clara replied, and the trust implicit in her words made Eli's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't entirely ready to name. The wagon ride to town gave them time to talk about what Clara might expect. Eli explained the social dynamics of their small community, who could be trusted, who was prone to gossip, and how best to navigate the complex web of relationships that defined frontier life. "Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house will want to know everything about you," he warned. "She considers herself the unofficial guardian of public morality. Dr. Morrison you already know, and he's a good man who'll keep your confidence. Martha Coolidge runs the general store with her husband, and she's fair-minded if a bit sharp-tongued." Clara absorbed this information, mentally preparing herself for the scrutiny she would face. "And Harold Briggs. We'll avoid him if possible," Eli said firmly. "No point in stirring up trouble unnecessarily." Their first stop was Dr. Morrison's office, where the kindly physician examined Clara and pronounced himself pleased with her recovery. "Color's much improved," he told Eli, with a knowing smile. "Fresh air and good food work wonders, especially when combined with peace of mind." At the general store, Clara experienced her first real test of public opinion. The conversations that had been flowing freely when they entered died to whispers as soon as people noticed her. She kept her head high, drawing on lessons learned in her father's schoolhouse about dignity in the face of adversity. Martha Coolidge proved to be exactly as Eli had described, sharp-eyed but fundamentally fair. "So you're the young lady who's been staying out at Eli's place," she said without preamble. "Folks have been wondering about you." "I imagine they have," Clara replied calmly. "It's natural for people to be curious about strangers." "Indeed it is. Especially when that stranger was rejected by Harold Briggs for being too sickly to make a proper wife." Martha's tone was blunt, but not unkind. "Course, anyone with sense could see Harold's a fool who wouldn't recognize quality if it bit him. On his considerable backside." Clara blinked in surprise at the unexpected support, and Martha's stern expression softened slightly. "I've been watching Eli Ramsey pine away in that house for 8 years. The older woman continued. "About time someone came along to remind him what living looks like." As they gathered their supplies, Clara noticed the way Eli positioned himself, slightly between her and the other customers, not obviously protective, but clearly alert to any sign of trouble. When old Tom Fletcher made a comment about fancy Eastern ladies who can't handle frontier life, Eli's response was quiet, but unmistakably firm. "Miss Whitmore has handled frontier life just fine," he said, his tone carrying a warning that made Fletcher back down immediately. "Better than some folks who've been here their whole lives." The interaction filled Clara with warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Here was a man who would defend her without making her feel weak, who supported her without overwhelming her growing independence. Their final stop was the small church where Pastor Williams, a soft-spoken man with gentle eyes, welcomed Clara warmly and invited them both to Sunday services. "Community is what keeps us strong out here," he said. "Everyone deserves a place to belong." On the wagon ride home, Clara was quiet, processing the mixed reactions she'd encountered. Some people had been openly curious, others cautiously welcoming, and a few had shown the kind of judgment she'd expected. But overall, the experience had been less daunting than she'd feared. "How do you think I did?" she asked as they reached the familiar comfort of the ranch road. "You handled yourself like the lady you are," Eli replied. "With grace and dignity, that put some of those folks to shame." That evening, as Clara arranged, some of her pressed flowers in a frame she'd made from wood scraps, she found herself thinking about the way Eli had stood beside her in town, not as her protector, but as her partner. The distinction was important, and it spoke to something fundamental about his character. "Eli," she said as he worked on carving the salt and pepper holders she'd requested, "can I ask you something personal?" "Course. What happened to the woman you were engaged to? The one you mentioned briefly that first night?" Eli's hands stilled on his carving, and for a moment Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell. We'd known each other since childhood, and everyone always assumed we'd marry eventually. When my father died and left me the ranch, it seemed natural to make it official." Clara waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "She was a good woman," Eli continued. "Pretty, accomplished, from a respected family. On paper, we were well suited. But when it came time to actually plan the wedding, to talk about the life we'd build together," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I realized that what I felt for her was affection and habit, not love. And she felt the same." What happened? A traveling photographer came through town that spring. Young man, full of stories about the wider world and dreams of documenting the changing frontier. Sarah took one look at him, and I knew I'd lost her, though I'm not sure I ever really had her to begin with. Clara set down her flower arrangement and looked at him directly. "Were you heartbroken?" Eli considered the question seriously. "I was disappointed, embarrassed, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, but heartbroken." He shook his head slowly. "No, I think I was more heartbroken about the idea of what I thought I wanted than about losing Sarah herself. And that's when you became a hermit? Seemed safer than risking that kind of mistake again, easier to live alone than to discover I didn't know how to love someone properly." Clara felt her heart ache for the years of loneliness this good man had endured, all because he'd confused compatibility with love and blamed himself when it wasn't enough. "Eli," she said softly, "there's a difference between not knowing how to love and simply not having found the right person to love." Their eyes met across the kitchen table, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that perhaps his long solitude had been self-imposed rather than inevitable. The carved horse on the windowsill seemed to catch the lamplight and dance, as if celebrating the possibility of new beginnings. Outside, the night sounds of the mountain valley provided a gentle symphony, and inside the ranch house, two people continued the delicate process of learning to trust not just each other, but the growing feelings that threatened to transform friendship into something infinitely more precious and terrifying. The nightmares began 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, arriving with the persistence of wolves stalking wounded prey. They came without warning, in the deep hours before dawn, pulling her from peaceful sleep into a world where shadowy figures pursued her through endless corridors, while a familiar voice whispered threats that made her skin crawl. Eli woke the first. Time to the sound of Clara crying out, her voice muffled but filled with such terror that he was down the stairs and at her door before fully conscious thought engaged. He stood in the hallway, his hand raised to knock, torn between the desire to comfort and respect for her privacy. "Clara," he called softly through the closed door. "Are you all right?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing. After a long moment, her voice came back, shaky but determined. "I'm sorry I woke you. It was just a bad dream. Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" "No, thank you. I'll be fine." But Eli could hear the tremor in her voice that suggested she was anything but fine. He remained outside her door for several minutes, listening to the sounds of movement as she apparently paced the room, before finally returning to his own bed, where sleep eluded him until dawn. The pattern repeated over the following nights, growing worse rather than better. Clara would wake screaming, always apologizing afterward, always insisting she was fine. During the days, she tried to hide the effects, but Eli could see the exhaustion gathering around her eyes like storm clouds, the way her hands shook slightly. When she thought no one was looking, it was Dr. Morrison who provided the explanation during his weekly visit to check on Clara's progress. "Delayed reaction to trauma," he said quietly, while Clara was out in the garden collecting herbs. "The mind has ways of protecting us during crisis, but once safety is established, sometimes all that suppressed fear comes rushing back." "Is there anything that can help?" Eli asked, his concern evident. "Time, patience, and the continued assurance that she's safe. The nightmares will fade, but she needs to process what she's been through. Sometimes talking about it helps, but it has to be her choice." That evening, Eli found Clara sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl and staring out at the mountains, painted purple by the setting sun. She looked fragile in the twilight, younger than her 23 years, and utterly alone despite his presence. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps when she nodded. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep dreaming that he's found me, that he's here, in this house, and there's nowhere left to run." Eli felt his hands clench involuntarily at the pain in her voice. "He's not here, Clara. He can't hurt you anymore." "In my dreams, he can. In my dreams, he's always been able to." She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's not just the fear of him finding me, it's the shame of how long I let it happen. How I convinced myself that his control was love, that his jealousy was devotion. That's not shame you should carry," Eli said firmly. "That's his shame, not yours." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How can you be so certain? You don't know what I allowed, what I accepted because I was too afraid or too weak to fight back." "I know you," Eli replied simply. "I know the woman who crossed 1,000 miles to escape a situation that was killing her. I know the woman who stands up straight even when she's terrified, who cooks with love even when she's exhausted, who finds beauty in pressed flowers and sees potential in a lonely man's whittled animals." The tears Clara had been fighting finally spilled over, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Sometimes I feel like I'm two different people," she admitted. "The woman I was before Marcus and the woman I became while I was with him. I'm not sure which one is really me." "Maybe you're both," Eli suggested gently. "Maybe you're the woman you were, strengthened by surviving what you endured." As if drawn by some invisible force, Eli reached out and gently brushed away the tears on Clara's cheek. The contact sent warmth shooting through both of them, and suddenly the careful distance they'd been maintaining seemed inadequate for the emotions building between them. "Eli," Clara whispered, and there was something in the way she said his name that made his breath catch. "Yes, I think I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. The admission hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable, and completely honest. Eli felt his heart race as he realized that what he'd been trying to deny for weeks was true. He was falling in love with her too, had been since that first day when she'd shown such dignity in the face of rejection. "Clara," he said softly, his hand still cupping her cheek, "you don't terrify me. This doesn't terrify me. What terrifies me is the thought of you leaving before I have the chance to show you what real love looks like." She searched his face in the starlight, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation, but finding only honest affection and a patience that spoke of a man willing to wait for her to heal. "What if I'm too damaged? What if I can't be the partner you deserve? What if you already are?" Eli countered gently. "What if you've been showing me every day what partnership looks like, and I've been too afraid to recognize it?" Clara felt something inside her chest unfurl, like a flower opening to sunlight. Here was a man who saw her strength rather than her weakness, who wanted to build something with her rather than simply possess her. "Show me," she whispered. Eli leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Clara met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. It tasted of hope and new beginnings, of two people choosing to trust despite the risks. When they finally pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, breathing in the familiar scent of wood shavings and honest work that had come to mean safety to her. "I want to try," she said quietly. "I want to see what we could build together." "We'll take it slow," Eli promised. "We'll take it at whatever pace you need." That night, for the first time in weeks, Clara slept without nightmares. And when she woke in the morning to find Eli sitting in the kitchen with coffee ready and a new wooden creation on the table, a pair of salt and pepper holders carved to look like dancing partners, she knew that she was finally ready to start building a future instead of just surviving the past. The old rifle hanging above the fireplace caught the morning light, cleaned and maintained, but symbolic now of protection rather than violence. Like everything else in this house, it spoke of a man who understood that true strength lay not in domination, but in the choice to shelter those who needed sanctuary. Outside, letters were beginning to arrive in town with her name on them. But inside the ranch house, Clara was learning what it meant to be loved by someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession to be controlled. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, delivered by a grim-faced postal clerk who seemed relieved to hand over the official-looking envelope and leave immediately. Clara recognized the heavy paper and elaborate seal before she saw the name written in Marcus Ashford's distinctive handwriting across the front. Miss Clara Elizabeth Whitmore. She stood in the kitchen doorway, the unopened letter trembling in her hands, all the color draining from her face. Eli looked up from his breakfast and immediately set down his coffee cup, rising to his feet with the fluid motion of a man preparing for trouble. "It's from him," Clara said unnecessarily, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't open it," Eli said firmly, crossing to her side. "Whatever he has to say, it can't be good." But Clara was already breaking the seal with shaking fingers, driven by the same compulsion that makes people look at accidents even when they know the sight will haunt them. The letter was written on Marcus's personal stationery, and even his handwriting seemed to radiate arrogance and control. "My dearest Clara," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier as anger began to replace fear. "Your little adventure in playing at independence has gone on quite long enough. I have been extraordinarily patient, allowing you time to recover from your temporary bout of hysteria, but my tolerance has reached its limit." Eli moved closer, his presence a steadying force as Clara continued reading. "You will be interested to know that your disappearance has caused considerable scandal in our social circle. Stories are circulating about your mental instability, your ingratitude toward a devoted fiancé who cared for you through a serious illness, and your apparent moral flexibility in taking up residence with a strange man in the wilderness." Clara's hands were shaking again, but now with rage rather than fear. "He's trying to destroy my reputation," she said through gritted teeth. "Keep reading," Eli said quietly, though his own jaw was tight with barely controlled anger. "However, I am prepared to overlook these transgressions and welcome you back with open arms. I have taken the liberty of arranging for your return journey, and my representatives will arrive within the week to escort you home. You will, of course, apologize publicly for your rash behavior, and we will proceed with our wedding plans immediately upon your return." The letter continued, but Clara stopped reading aloud as her eyes scanned the final paragraphs. What she saw there made her sink into the nearest chair, the paper falling from nerveless fingers. "Clara?" Eli knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle, but urgent. "What is it? What else does it say?" With trembling hands, Clara picked up the letter and read the rest silently, her face growing pale as she absorbed the full implications of Marcus's threats. When she finished, she looked up at Eli with eyes full of despair. "He's not just threatening me," she said quietly. "He's threatening you, this place, anyone who has helped me. He says he has legal documents proving I'm mentally incompetent and legally bound to return to his care. He claims I stole money from him when I left, and that you're harboring a known thief." Eli's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. "Let me see that letter." Clara handed it over, watching as Eli read the final paragraphs with growing fury. Marcus had been thorough in his threats. If Clara didn't return willingly, he would have Eli arrested for kidnapping and theft. He would use his considerable influence to ensure that Eli lost his ranch and faced serious jail time. The local sheriff would be powerless against the legal documents Marcus claimed to possess. "This is blackmail," Eli said flatly. "This is Marcus," Clara replied bitterly. "He always has contingency plans, ways to force people to do what he wants. I should have known he wouldn't simply let me go." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Clara's mind was working. Something about the letter's tone, the specific threats Marcus had made, suggested that his position might not be as strong as he wanted her to believe. "Eli," she said slowly, "help me think through this. If Marcus really had ironclad legal authority to bring me back, why would he bother with threats and manipulation? Why not simply show up with a federal marshal and drag me away?" Eli considered this, his analytical mind engaging with the problem. "You're right. The threats suggest he's trying to avoid a legal confrontation, not that he's confident of winning." Clara rose and began pacing the kitchen, her mind racing. "And there's something else. He mentions legal documents proving I'm mentally incompetent, but those would have to be signed by a doctor. The only doctor who examined me regularly was Dr. Patterson, and I know he would never have signed such papers. Could Marcus have forged them? Possibly. But that would be a serious crime if discovered. No, I think he's bluffing, at least partially." Clara stopped pacing and turned to face Eli, determination replacing despair in her expression. "There's something I haven't told you about my father's death. Something Dr. Patterson shared with me just before I left Pennsylvania." Eli waited patiently, sensing that whatever Clara was about to reveal would change everything. "My father didn't just die of natural causes," Clara said quietly. "Dr. Patterson suspected that he was being poisoned too, the same way I was. He'd been experiencing symptoms similar to mine for months before his death, but everyone attributed them to his existing heart condition. It wasn't until after my father died that Dr. Patterson began to piece together the pattern. The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. "Marcus killed your father?" "Dr. Patterson believed so, yes. And he gave me something before I left. Medical records documenting the symptoms, the timeline, his suspicions. He said I might need them someday as insurance." Clara moved to her suitcase, which still sat in the corner of the kitchen where she'd placed it that first day. With careful fingers, she felt along the lining until she found the hidden pocket she'd sewn there. From the secret compartment, she withdrew a small bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth. Dr. Patterson's complete medical records on both my father and myself, including his professional opinion that we were both being systematically poisoned. He also included a statement detailing Marcus's suspicious behavior and his own concerns about our welfare. Eli examined the papers with growing amazement. "Clara, this is evidence of murder. If what Dr. Patterson suspected is true, Marcus isn't just a controlling fiancé, he's a killer. Which explains why he's so desperate to get me back," Clara said, her voice growing stronger as she began to understand the true scope of her situation. "I'm not just a runaway bride to him. I'm a witness to murder, someone who could destroy his entire life if the right people see these documents." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and through the kitchen window they could see a small group of riders approaching the ranch house. Clara counted 3 men, all well-dressed and riding horses that looked too fine for ordinary cowboys. "They're here sooner than he said they'd be," Clara observed, though her voice was remarkably calm given the circumstances. Eli moved to the window and studied the approaching riders with the trained eye of someone who'd learned to assess threats quickly. "Professional men," he said quietly, "but they're not lawmen, no badges, no official demeanor. These are hired guns dressed up to look respectable." Clara joined him at the window, and together they watched as the 3 men dismounted and approached the front porch with the confident swagger of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. "Whatever happens," Eli said quietly, his hand finding Clara's, "we face it together. You're not going back to him, Clara. Not ever." The knock on the front door came as no surprise, but the authoritative tone of the voice that followed sent chills down Clara's spine. "Miss Whitmore, we know you're in there. We have legal documents requiring your immediate return to Pennsylvania. Come out now, and this can all be handled quietly." Clara looked at Eli, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Do you think we can fight this?" "I think we can try," Eli replied, "and I think Dr. Patterson gave you the weapons we need to win." The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by threats about breaking down the door if necessary. But inside the ranch house, Clara was no longer the frightened, half-starved woman who had arrived on the train platform 2 months ago. She was someone who had found her strength, her voice, and most importantly, someone willing to fight beside her. "Mr. Ramsey," one of the men called out, "you're harboring a known thief and a woman of questionable mental capacity. Surrender her now or face the legal consequences." Clara squeezed Eli's hand and stepped toward the door. "I think it's time to show Marcus Ashford that he's not the only one who knows how to fight." The hours that followed the arrival of Marcus's men tested every ounce of courage and determination that Clara and Eli had discovered in themselves over the past 2 months. The 3 hired guns, for that's what they were, despite their expensive suits and polished manners, had settled into a careful siege of the ranch house, making it clear they had no intention of leaving without Clara. Eli moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of someone whose past held more secrets than he'd shared. From the closet in his bedroom, he retrieved items that spoke of a history Clara was only beginning to understand. A cavalry sword wrapped in oiled cloth, field glasses that had seen military service, and most significantly, a leather saddlebag, bearing the faded insignia of the U.S. Army. "You were a soldier," Clara said, watching him check the action of his father's rifle with the automatic motions of someone who'd done it countless times before. "Cavalry scout for 8 years, Eli replied, his voice carrying the weight of old memories. "Served under Colonel Hayes during the Apache campaigns, then spent 2 years tracking deserters and criminals across 3 territories. I know how men like that think, how they operate." The revelation recontextualized everything Clara thought she knew about the quiet man who had saved her. The patience, the careful observation, the way he could read people and situations. These weren't just the traits of a thoughtful rancher, but the skills of someone who had survived by being smarter and more resourceful than his enemies. "The lead man out there calls himself Johnson," Eli continued, studying the men through a gap in the curtains. "But I've seen his face before on wanted posters. Real name's Jack Morrison, and he's wanted for assault and intimidation in 3 states. The other 2 are hired muscle, probably picked up in Denver." Clara felt a strange sense of calm settling over her as she absorbed this information. For the first time since receiving Marcus's letter, she felt like they might actually have a chance. What do we do? First, we get word to town. Dr. Morrison needs to know what's happening, and we need Sheriff Bradley out here to witness whatever evidence you have. Eli moved to his desk and quickly scrawled a note. "Can you make it to the barn without being seen? There's a trail through the back pasture that leads to the Morrison place." "I can try. Take Thunder. He's the black stallion in the end stall. He knows the trail and he's fast enough to outrun anything they might send after you." Eli handed her the note and a small leather pouch. "Give this to Dr. Morrison. Tell him to bring Sheriff Bradley and anyone else he trusts. And Clara, if something goes wrong here, if they take me, don't try to rescue me. Get to the territorial capital and find a federal marshal." Clara looked at this man who had become everything to her, seeing him now with new eyes. The quiet rancher, who carved wooden animals, was also a warrior, who had spent years protecting others from exactly the kind of men who now threatened them. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "You're not leaving me," Eli said firmly. "You're getting the help we need to end this properly. Marcus made a mistake when he sent criminals instead of lawmen. That gives us options he didn't count on." The back of the house offered concealment from the watching men, and Clara slipped out through the kitchen door with the stealth Eli had taught her during their walks around the property. The barn seemed impossibly far away, but she made it without raising an alarm, moving from shadow to shadow with her heart pounding, but her mind clear. Thunder was indeed magnificent, a powerful black stallion who seemed to sense the urgency of the situation. Clara had learned to ride during her time at the ranch, though never anything quite so spirited. But the horse responded to her gentle confidence, and soon they were moving through the back pasture at a ground-eating pace that would have them at Dr. Morrison's house within the hour. Behind her, she could hear voices raised in argument as the hired guns discovered her absence. Part of her wanted to look back, to reassure herself that Eli was safe, but she forced herself to focus ahead. He was counting on her to bring help, and she would not fail him. Dr. Morrison's reaction to her news was swift and decisive. Within minutes, he had dispatched his son to fetch Sheriff Bradley, while he himself prepared to ride back to the ranch with Clara. "Jack Morrison," he muttered, as he gathered medical supplies and ammunition. "Should have known Marcus Ashford would hire the worst kind of men. That family always did believe money could buy anything, including justice." Sheriff Bradley arrived with 2 deputies, both men Clara recognized from town as solid, dependable types who wouldn't be easily intimidated by expensive lawyers or forged documents. More importantly, they listened carefully as Clara explained the situation and showed them Dr. Patterson's medical records. "Murder's a serious charge," Sheriff Bradley said after reading through the documents. "But if this Dr. Patterson is willing to testify, and if these records are genuine, we might have enough to file charges against this Ashford fellow." "They're genuine," Clara said firmly. "Dr. Patterson risked his own career to give me those papers. He knew what Marcus was, even if he couldn't prove it at the time." The ride back to the ranch was tense but hopeful. Clara found herself thinking about the man waiting for her there, the way he had revealed new depths just when she thought she knew him completely. The quiet rancher, the talented artist, the patient teacher, and now the experienced soldier, all facets of a man complex enough to match her own complicated heart. As they approached the ranch, they could see that the situation had escalated. In Clara's absence, 2 of the hired guns were positioned to watch the approaches, while the third, presumably Jack Morrison, continued his verbal siege of the house, alternating between threats and false promises of leniency. "Ramsey!" Morrison was shouting. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We just want the woman and then we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt." Sheriff Bradley signaled for his men to spread out and approach from different angles. "When I give the word," he told Clara quietly, "you ride hard for the house. We'll handle these three." But Clara had a different idea. "Sheriff, what if we approach openly? They're pretending to be legitimate agents with legal authority. Let's see how they react when faced with real law enforcement." Sheriff Bradley considered. This, then nodded slowly. "You might be right. If they were confident in their legal position, they wouldn't be hiding behind siege tactics." The group rode openly toward the ranch house, Sheriff Bradley in the lead with his badge clearly visible. The reaction from Morrison's men was immediate and telling. Instead of greeting fellow law enforcement officers, they reached for their weapons with the instinctive response of men who knew they were on the wrong side of the law. "That's far enough," Morrison called out, his hand resting on his gun. "This is official business, and we don't need local interference." "I'm Sheriff Bradley, and this is my jurisdiction," the sheriff replied calmly. "I'll need to see your legal documents and federal authority before you can proceed." Morrison's hesitation was brief but significant. "Our authority comes from Pennsylvania state courts. We don't answer to local sheriffs." "Actually, you do," Sheriff Bradley said, dismounting. With deliberate calm, "Any law enforcement action in my county requires my notification and approval. I'll need to examine your papers and verify your credentials." Clara watched the exchange with growing confidence. Morrison's bluster was cracking, revealing the uncertainty beneath. These men had been prepared to intimidate a lone rancher and a frightened woman, not to face legitimate law enforcement with proper documentation. From the house came Eli's voice, strong and clear. "Clara, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she called back. "We brought help." The front door opened, and Eli stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Clara felt her heart lift at the sight of him, safe and unharmed, his steady presence a counterpoint to the tension crackling in the air. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Bradley continued, his tone growing more authoritative, "I'm still waiting to see those legal documents. If you can't produce proper federal paperwork, I'll have to assume you're operating outside the law." The moment stretched like a wire under tension, everyone understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended with words or violence. Clara dismounted and began walking toward the house, testing Morrison's resolve. Ready to run if he made any threatening moves. But it was Dr. Morrison who provided the final catalyst, riding up with a leather satchel that Clara recognized. "Jack Morrison," the doctor called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Or should I say Jack Henley? You're wanted for questioning in the death of Thomas Whitmore, and I have medical evidence that suggests his death was not from natural causes." The use of Morrison's real name and the mention of her father's death caused the hired gun to visibly start. His careful facade cracked completely, revealing the desperation beneath, and Clara knew that the final confrontation was about to begin. The revelation of Jack Morrison's true identity and connection to her father's death hit Clara like a physical blow. But instead of weakness, it brought a surge of righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of fear. This man hadn't just been hired to intimidate her. He had been present when her father died, possibly even instrumental in his murder. "You," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "You were there when my father passed. You were one of Marcus's associates who visited the house." Morrison's mask slipped further, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady. Never seen you before in my life." But Clara was remembering now, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "You came to dinner twice in the weeks before father died. Marcus introduced you as a business partner from Philadelphia. You complimented my cooking, asked about the herbs I used in the tea." Dr. Morrison opened his satchel and withdrew a folded document. According to Dr. Patterson's records, Thomas Whitmore's symptoms began shortly after meeting with unknown business. Associates of Marcus Ashford. The timeline matches perfectly with visits from outside parties who had access to his food and drink. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his deputies flanking him with weapons drawn, but not yet aimed. "Mr. Morrison, I'm placing you and your associates under arrest for suspicion of murder and conspiracy. You have the right to—" "Like hell you are," Morrison snarled, abandoning all pretense as his hand moved to his gun. The next few seconds unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Morrison's draw was fast, but Eli was faster, his cavalry training serving him well as he brought his rifle to bear. Clara dove behind the water trough as gunfire erupted, Sheriff Bradley and his deputies engaging Morrison's men in a brief but violent exchange. When the smoke cleared, one of Morrison's associates lay motionless in the dust. Another was clutching a wounded shoulder, and Morrison himself stood with his hands raised, blood running from a crease along his scalp, where Eli's shot had come close enough to convince him that surrender was preferable to death. "It's over," Sheriff Bradley said firmly, his smoking revolver still trained on the survivors. "Drop your weapons and get on your knees." As the deputies moved to secure the prisoners, Clara emerged from her shelter and ran to Eli, who was already moving toward her with the purposeful stride of a man whose first priority was ensuring her safety. They met in the middle of the yard, and she threw herself into his arms with a force that spoke of how terrified she'd been of losing him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, running her hands over his chest and arms, checking for wounds. "I'm fine," he assured her, holding her tightly. "Are you?" Before Clara could answer, Dr. Morrison approached with his medical bag and a grim expression. "We need to search these men thoroughly. If they were involved in poisoning operations, they might be carrying evidence we can use." The search proved fruitful beyond their hopes. In Morrison's saddlebags, they discovered a collection of small vials containing various substances, along with detailed notes about dosages and effects. More damning still was a leather portfolio containing correspondence between Morrison and Marcus Ashford, outlining not just the plan to retrieve Clara, but references to previous successful operations that could only refer to her father's murder. "This is enough to hang Ashford," Sheriff Bradley said grimly as he examined the evidence. "Murder, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, we've got him dead to rights." But Clara was focused on something else she'd found among Morrison's effects. A small bundle wrapped in oilcloth that contained items she recognized from her father's study. "These are father's papers," she said quietly, unwrapping the bundle with trembling hands. "His personal correspondence, some legal documents. Why would Morrison have these?" Dr. Morrison examined the papers carefully, his medical training making him methodical even in his examination of evidence. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a particular document. "This is your father's will, Clara. The real one, not the version that was probated after his death." Clara read the document with growing amazement, her father's careful handwriting revealing truths that Marcus had worked hard to conceal. "According to this, father left everything to me, not just his personal effects, but property, investments, even some mineral rights he'd acquired years ago. The probated will that gave Marcus control of the estate. It was a forgery. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just killed her father for the satisfaction of control. He'd murdered him for money, forging a new will that made himself the beneficiary while leaving Clara with nothing but debt and dependency. "So you're not just a runaway bride," Eli said quietly, understanding the full scope of what they'd uncovered. "You're a wealthy woman whose inheritance was stolen through murder and fraud." "Ashford's more desperate than we thought," Sheriff Bradley observed. "If this real will surfaces, he loses everything. No wonder he was willing to hire killers to—" "Get you back." Clara looked at the evidence scattered around them. The poison vials, the forged documents, the correspondence detailing years of careful planning and execution. Marcus hadn't just been controlling and possessive. He'd been a calculating murderer who'd seen her and her father as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be cherished. "What happens now?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand. That the answer would determine not just her future, but Eli's as well. "Now we send telegrams," Dr. Morrison said firmly, "to the territorial governor, to federal marshals, to Dr. Patterson in Pennsylvania. We make sure this evidence reaches people who can't be bought or intimidated by Ashford's money. And Morrison and his surviving associate will stand trial here for attempted kidnapping and assault," Sheriff Bradley added. "Their testimony about Ashford's involvement will be crucial for the murder charges." As the prisoners were loaded into the sheriff's wagon and the evidence carefully catalogued, Clara found herself standing beside Eli on the porch of the ranch house that had become her sanctuary. The confrontation was over, but she knew that the legal battle ahead would be long and complex. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Eli asked quietly. "Once this gets out, once the trials begin, your life will never be simple again," Clara considered. This, thinking about the woman she'd been when she first stepped off the train platform, frightened, sick, completely dependent on others for survival. That woman seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who had found her strength and her voice through adversity and love. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "But I want you to know that whatever wealth my father left me, whatever property or rights I inherit, none of it matters compared to what I've found here with you." Eli's weathered face softened with an emotion that took Clara's breath away. "Clara Whitmore," he said gently, "are you proposing to me?" The question made her laugh, a sound of pure joy that seemed to banish the last shadows of fear and uncertainty. "I suppose I am," she said, "though I should warn you that you'd be marrying a woman with very complicated legal problems." "I've always preferred complicated women," Eli replied, pulling her close. "They're more interesting than the simple ones." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara and Eli stood together on the porch of the ranch house where they'd found each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, and the complex process of rebuilding a life that had been stolen through treachery and murder. But tonight, they had each other. They had the truth, and they had the unshakable knowledge that love could indeed triumph over the darkest of circumstances. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by the evidence Clara and Eli had uncovered, moved with surprising swiftness. Within a week of Jack Morrison's arrest, telegrams began arriving from across the country as the scope of Marcus Ashford's criminal enterprise became clear to federal authorities. Dr. Patterson's testimony, delivered via telegraph from Pennsylvania, corroborated every detail of the medical evidence. More damaging still, other victims began to come forward. Families who had lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances after business dealings with Marcus, all following the same pattern of gradual poisoning disguised as natural illness. Territorial governor himself arrived to oversee the proceedings, bringing with him federal marshals and a stern-faced prosecutor who specialized in cases involving fraud and murder. The small town of Cedar Falls had never seen such official attention, and the atmosphere crackled with the electricity of impending justice. Clara stood in the courthouse, dressed in her finest clothes and flanked by Eli and Dr. Morrison as she formally identified Jack Morrison and testified about his presence in her father's house during the weeks before Thomas Whitmore's death. Her voice was steady and clear as she recounted the systematic poisoning she'd endured, the forged will, and Marcus's attempts to control every aspect of her life. "The defendant posed as a business associate," Clara testified, looking directly at Morrison, who sat shackled at the defendant's table. "He complimented my cooking and specifically asked about the herbs I used in preparing tea and other beverages. I now understand that he was gathering information about how to introduce poison into my father's daily routine without suspicion." Morrison's surviving associate, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of hanging for murder, had agreed to testify against both his partner and Marcus Ashford in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony painted a picture of a criminal organization that had operated for years, using murder and fraud to acquire wealth and property from unsuspecting victims. Ashford paid us well for what he called problem-solving, the man testified, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes it was intimidation, sometimes it was theft, but with Thomas Whitmore, it was murder. Ashford wanted him dead and wanted it to look natural. So Morrison developed a plan using small doses of arsenic mixed with other substances to mask the symptoms. The prosecution's case was airtight, but the defense attorney, a nervous man who had clearly been hired more for his willingness to take a hopeless case than for his competence, made one final attempt to discredit Clara's testimony. "Is it not true, Miss Whitmore," he asked during cross-examination, "that you fled Pennsylvania under cover of darkness, using a false name and abandoning your legal obligations to Mr. Ashford? Does this not suggest a guilty conscience rather than innocent victimhood?" Clara had been prepared for this line of attack, and her response came with the calm authority of someone who had found her strength through adversity. "I fled because I was being slowly murdered," she said clearly. "I used a false name because I knew that my killer would pursue me. And as for legal obligations to Mr. Ashford, I was never legally bound to a man who murdered my father and forged documents to steal my inheritance." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. When order was restored, the judge himself addressed the defense attorney with barely concealed irritation. "Counselor, unless you have evidence to present that contradicts the substantial documentation already entered into evidence, I suggest you conclude your examination. This court will not tolerate attempts to blame victims for their attackers' crimes." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison was sentenced to hang for murder. His associate received 20 years in territorial prison, and warrants were immediately issued for Marcus Ashford's arrest on charges of murder, fraud, conspiracy, and theft. But the legal victory was only part of Clara's vindication. The revelation of her true inheritance, carefully documented by her father and corroborated by banking records that federal investigators had uncovered, transformed her from a penniless refugee into one of the wealthiest women in the territory. According to these documents, the federal prosecutor explained to Clara and Eli in the courthouse's private chambers, "Your father accumulated substantial holdings over the years. Property in Pennsylvania, mining investments in Colorado, railroad, bonds, and a considerable amount in cash deposits. Marcus Ashford has been living off your inheritance for over a year." Clara absorbed this information with mixed emotions. The money would ensure security and comfort, but it also represented the life her father should have lived, the years that had been stolen from both of them by Marcus's greed. "What happens to the property Ashford acquired using the forged will?" Eli asked, his practical mind already considering the complexities ahead. "It reverts to Miss Whitmore, naturally. Our investigators are working with Pennsylvania authorities to freeze all of Ashford's assets, pending his arrest and trial. It's likely that Miss Whitmore will recover not only her original inheritance, but substantial additional compensation." "For the fraud." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Clara found herself thinking not about the money or the property, but about the badge that Sheriff Bradley wore, the symbol of honest law enforcement that had made justice possible. In Pennsylvania, Marcus's wealth and connections had made him untouchable, but here in the Colorado territory, truth and evidence had prevailed over corruption and influence. "I have something for you," Eli said as they reached the courthouse. The steps. From his pocket he withdrew a small wooden box that Clara recognized as his own handiwork. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, were 2 simple gold rings that had clearly been crafted by the local blacksmith. "Eli Ramsey," Clara said, her voice catching with emotion. "Are you proposing to me on the courthouse steps?" "I'm proposing to you." "Everywhere," he replied with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "On the courthouse steps, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the barn, wherever you'll have me." I love you, Clara Whitmore, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that not all men use love as a weapon for control. Clara looked at this man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, who had shown her that strength could be gentle, and that true partnership meant standing together as equals. The rings in the box were simple compared to the elaborate jewelry Marcus had used to mark his ownership, but they represented something infinitely more precious, a choice freely, made by two people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss. Yes, she said simply, and the word carried with it all the hope and courage and love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. As Eli slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara realized that the frightened woman who had stepped off the train platform 2 months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true love didn't seek to diminish or control, but to celebrate and strengthen. The legal battles ahead would be complex, but they would face them together, and that made all the difference. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a symbol of justice finally served, while ahead lay a future limited only by their capacity to love and be loved in return. 1 year later, Clara Ramsey stood in the kitchen of the ranch house that had become her true home, her hands deep in bread dough, while the late afternoon sun streamed through windows that now held pressed flowers in delicate frames. The woman kneading bread bore little resemblance to the frightened, half-starved creature who had been rejected on the train platform. Her cheeks held the bloom of health and happiness, her eyes sparkled with confidence, and her movements carried the assurance of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The legal battles were finally over. Marcus Ashford had been arrested in Philadelphia, tried, and sentenced to life in prison for multiple murders. The stolen inheritance had been fully restored, along with additional damages that made Clara one of the wealthiest women in the Colorado Territory. But more satisfying than the money was the knowledge that justice had been served, that her father's death had been avenged, and that other families would be safe from Marcus's predations. "Something smells like heaven in here," Eli said, entering through the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and sawdust in his hair. He'd been working on a new project in the barn, a cradle carved from cherry wood with the same meticulous care he brought to all his creations. "Fresh bread and apple preserves," Clara replied, turning to accept his kiss with the easy affection of a woman secure in her husband's love. "Your mother's recipe, with a few improvements I learned from watching. You work with wood. Patience and attention to detail make all the difference." Eli wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both looked out at the ranch that had become their shared kingdom. The property had expanded significantly with Clara's inheritance, but they'd been careful to maintain the intimate feeling that had made it a sanctuary. Additional pastures had been added for the growing herd of horses, a new barn built to house Eli's increasingly elaborate woodworking shop, and a greenhouse constructed to extend Clara's growing season for both flowers and herbs. "Dr. Morrison should be here soon," Clara said, leaning back against Eli's solid warmth. "He's bringing news from town, and I suspect it's the kind of news that calls for a celebration." The news, when it came, was indeed worth celebrating. Pastor Williams had officially sanctioned the small church they'd built on the ranch property, making it possible for other isolated families to gather for services without the long journey to town. More importantly, Dr. Morrison brought word that 3 more families had settled in the valley, drawn by stories of the community spirit and mutual support that Clara and Eli had fostered. "You've created something special here," Dr. Morrison said as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Not just a ranch, but a real community where people look out for each other." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach, where the first signs of new life were just beginning to make themselves known. She and Eli had decided to wait until they were certain before sharing the news, but the knowledge filled her with a joy so profound it seemed to radiate from every pore. "We had good examples," she replied, thinking of her parents, of Dr. Patterson, who had risked his career to save her, of Dr. Morrison, who had become both friend and surrogate father. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who choose to care for each other through good times and bad. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sheriff Bradley and his wife, Martha, who had become one of Clara's closest friends. They were followed by the Henderson family from the neighboring ranch, then by young Tom Fletcher, who had courted and married Martha Coolidge's daughter just last month. What began as a quiet evening became an impromptu gathering, with neighbors, sharing news and laughter as naturally as breathing. Clara moved among them with the grace of a natural hostess, ensuring everyone had food and drink while Eli entertained the children with stories and simple magic tricks that left them wide-eyed with wonder. "Look at this," Martha Bradley said quietly to Clara as they watched Eli carve a small horse for one of the Henderson children. 2 years ago, that man barely spoke to anyone. Now he's the heart of this community. He always had it in him. Clara replied, her voice warm with pride and love. He just needed someone to remind him that isolation isn't safety, it's just another kind of prison. As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to leave, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The train platform where she'd been rejected now seemed like something from another woman's life, a necessary darkness that had led her to this perfect light. Eli's father's pocket watch, which he now carried every day, chimed the hour as they said their final goodbyes. The timepiece that had stopped at the moment of his father's death now marked each precious minute of a life fully lived, each second a gift to be treasured rather than simply endured. "Penny for your thoughts," Eli said as they stood alone on the porch, his arm around Clara's waist as they watched their friends disappear into the gathering dusk. "I was thinking about time," Clara replied, leaning into his warmth. "How it can seem to stop when we're afraid or grieving, and how it can fly when we're happy. Your father's watch stopped for 8 years, but now it's marking moments that matter again." "Speaking of moments that matter," Eli said, his voice carrying a note that made Clara look up at him with curiosity, "I have something for you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box similar to the one that had held their wedding rings. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a delicate wooden flower, a wild rose carved with such exquisite detail that Clara could almost smell its fragrance. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "But what's the occasion?" "The occasion," Eli said with the smile that still had the power to make her heart race, "is that I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I wanted you to have something beautiful to mark this particular moment in time." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the deeper meaning behind his gift. This wasn't just a carved flower, it was a symbol of growth, of beauty emerging from careful tending, of love that bloomed even in harsh conditions. "I have something to tell." "You too," she said softly, placing her hand over his heart. "Something that's going to change our lives in the most wonderful way." The joy that lit Eli's face when she shared her news was like sunrise over the mountains, gradual at first, then blazing with such intensity that it transformed everything it touched. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around the porch, both of them laughing with the pure delight of two people who had found their perfect happiness. "A baby," he said wonderingly, setting her down with exquisite gentleness. "Our baby, our baby," Clara confirmed, and in those two words lay the promise of a future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities and adventures yet to be discovered. As they stood together on the porch of the ranch house where they'd found each other, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Clara thought about the mail-order bride who had been rejected for being too sick to make a proper wife. That woman's greatest dreams had been so much smaller than the reality that love had made possible. Inside the house, the carved wooden horse sat on the kitchen windowsill where it had always been, But now it was joined by other creations: salt and pepper holders shaped like dancing partners, a spoon rest carved to look like a sleeping cat, and shelves lined with the evidence of two people who had learned to create beauty together. The pressed flowers in their frames caught the last light of day, preserved forever like the memories they'd made in this place where love had proved stronger than fear, where two broken people had discovered they could be whole together, and where every sunset promised another day of choosing each other over and over again. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying other travelers toward their own uncertain destinies. But Clara no longer thought about trains with fear or regret. Instead, she thought about journeys that led home, about the courage it took to trust in love, and about the infinite possibilities that opened up when two people decided to face the world together. The pocket watch in Eli's vest continued its steady ticking, marking time that moved forward now instead of standing still, each second a gift to be cherished, each minute a building block in a life constructed from love, trust, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the most beautiful destinations are found at the end of the most difficult journeys.